July 22, 1991. If you were walking through the Grand Avenue Mall in Milwaukee, you would have seen nothing out of the ordinary. It was a completely mundane summer day, and for a young man named Edward, it started with a brief, friendly conversation with a charming stranger. The stranger made a simple offer. He needed a few photographs taken, and he was willing to pay $50 and throw in a beer for the trouble. It was a harmless transaction. Edward agreed, and the two walked out of the mall and headed toward the man's apartment. But the moment the door to apartment 213 closed behind them, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside was thick and deeply foul. It smelled intensely of decaying meat, masked poorly by heavy industrial chemicals. Strange containers sat out in the open. Before Edward could process the scene, the stranger lunged. There was a sharp, metallic snap. A heavy steel handcuff locked tightly onto Edward's wrist. The charming stranger vanished, replaced by a quiet, calculating predator. Edward was trapped inside a locked apartment with Jeffrey Dahmer, and though Edward didn't know it yet, his captor had already murdered 17 people. The path to apartment 213 began 3 decades earlier. Born in 1960, Dahmer grew up in a volatile home. His mother struggled with severe prescription pill addiction, resulting in frequent hospitalizations, while his parents engaged in constant, violent screaming matches. Dahmer isolated himself to escape the chaos. Trying to connect with his withdrawn son, Dahmer's father, a scientist, taught him how to strip and clean animal bones by dissecting roadkill. He thought he was fostering a healthy interest in biology. Instead, he was handing his son a physical outlet for a growing, dark curiosity. The process of cutting open animals became a psychological refuge. Over time, Dahmer's fascination mutated. He began to associate the macabre, the grotesque, and the dead with comfort. By adolescence, that comfort had crossed over into deep physical arousal. In 1978, at 18 years old, those compulsions spilled over into human violence. Home alone, Dahmer invited a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks inside for a drink. When Hicks tried to leave for a concert, Dahmer panicked. He grabbed a heavy dumbbell and struck Hicks over the head, killing him instantly. Now faced with a corpse, Dahmer fell back on what his father had taught him. He methodically dismantled the body. He shattered the bones with a hammer, dissolved the remains in harsh acid, and flushed the chemical slurry down the toilet. He scrubbed the floors until no trace remained. Nobody noticed Hicks was gone. Dahmer had committed a flawless murder. That silence validated his darkest urges, proving to him that he could hunt humans, tear them apart, and face absolutely no consequences. Fast forward to the late 1980s, and his killing spree exploded in volume. He developed a highly specific hunting pattern. He preyed almost exclusively on vulnerable black men, offering them cash for photos at local bars, bus stops, and shopping centers. He was able to kill with impunity because he understood the systemic blind spots of the era. He targeted marginalized minority communities, knowing full well that police routinely ignored their complaints and dismissed their missing persons reports. Once inside his apartment, the routine was merciless. He laced their drinks with heavy sedatives, strangled them, and butchered the remains. He preserved their skulls as trophies in his bedroom and began cooking and consuming pieces of their flesh. Dahmer's ultimate obsession was to keep his victims with him forever, even after their hearts stopped beating. This led to his horrifying zombie experiments. As illustrated in this diagram, he would drill small holes directly into the skulls of his living, drugged victims and inject corrosive chemicals into their brains, trying to strip away their free will and create permanently submissive companions. The sheer volume of these crimes required active negligence from the outside world. Smells leaked into the hallways. Victims occasionally escaped, only to be handed back to Dahmer by police officers who refused to investigate further. His apartment became an active slaughterhouse hidden in plain sight. Which brings us back to July 1991, with Edward handcuffed in apartment 213. As Dahmer tried to pull him toward the bedroom, Edward looked at the strange chemical vats and the heavy locks on the door. He knew if he crossed the threshold into that bedroom, he would never leave. Edward played along, waiting for a fraction of a second where Dahmer's attention drifted. He grabbed the nearest heavy object, spun around, and swung with everything he had. The blow dropped Dahmer to the floor. Edward scrambled out the door, sprinting into the street until he flagged down a patrol car. That night, he led authorities right back to door 213, finally exposing the horrifying truth inside. When officers opened the refrigerator, they found 3 severed human heads sitting on the shelves. Strewn across the living space were jars of preserved organs, human skulls, and a cluster of blue industrial drums, identical to these, filled with acid and dissolving human remains. 13 years of unchecked violence, 17 victims discovered, and countless ignored warning signs. It took the desperate physical willpower of one man fighting for his life to tear down the operation. The legal system moved quickly. Standing in a wood-paneled courtroom much like this one, Dahmer offered no resistance. He was convicted and handed a sentence of nearly 1,000 years in prison. Behind bars, his life settled into a quiet routine. He was a compliant prisoner. He even turned to religion, officially getting baptized, believing he could quietly live out his remaining decades reading and cleaning the prison facilities. But on November 28, 1994, that routine violently ended. While cleaning a prison bathroom, Dahmer was cornered by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Armed with a heavy metal bar, Scarver struck Dahmer repeatedly, beating him to death on the concrete floor. Scarver, who was black, later stated he was utterly disgusted by Dahmer's specific targeting of black men. He claimed that God had explicitly directed him to corner Dahmer and execute divine retribution for the men who had been butchered. Dahmer died at the age of 34, his skull crushed on a concrete floor. His death ended the legal case, but the discovery of his acid-filled slaughterhouse remains a stark reminder that extreme violence often hides behind a completely unremarkable face.